Welcome everybody to this year's the New England Society of Wetland Scientists New England chapter meeting for 2020. The opening remarks here, I just want to, where we're doing it as a Zoom webinar, which is a new webinar or Zoom format for me. I've typically done the straightforward Zoom meetings, so it's a different event for me, not being able to see everybody on the Zoom call. And, so we are, doing this new and remote. We have folks from SWS assisting us, Tony and Emily. I'd just like Emily to take a couple of minutes and explain how the webinar will work, how people can chat, have questions and answers, because we will have we'll have to vote the minutes and we'll vote to adjourn. And we'll have questions, and that's going to be through the chat box. So Emily, if you can just take a minute or two and explain that.
Yeah, thanks, Dwight. So welcome everybody. We're really excited to have you here in this format. I know a lot of us are familiar with Zoom meetings these days, but might not be as familiar with the webinar features. So I just want to point out a couple things. There is the regular chat box. Love seeing everyone say hi, maybe just say hi, introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from. And we can talk back and forth that way. You can ask Tony and I for help if you need any assistance. You'll also see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box. So if you have specific questions for our speakers as they're talking, you can go ahead and drop them there. We are going to wait to answer all questions until the end of each segment, just to make sure everyone has time to get through their entire presentation. So drop them in the question box as you think of them, and then Tony and I will read them at the end of each segment to the panelists. You are all muted, so don't worry about, if you've got background noise or anything like that at home. If you think of something at the end during the Q&A session that might be better served as like dialogue back and forth, you should have the option to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and you can vocally ask a question to the speakers if that's appropriate. So if you've got any questions, just drop them in the chat box, either to all panelists or directed at myself or Tony, and we'll be happy to help.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And Emily and Tony, I've gotten a couple of emails from folks that are having a difficulty logging in. So I don't know if there are people still in the waiting room that need to be join.
Yeah, so everyone's got a unique link that Zoom sent them. I think Susanna sent a reminder about that this morning, but I'll check in with her as we
get started. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to open this year's annual meeting with the first order of business being to vote and accept the minutes from the 2019 annual meeting. They were prepared and submitted by Ruth Ladd, and I won't read them verbatim. They've been circulated to several, many of the folks, but just the basically we had the call to order last year at 1:07, October 5th, at Central Connecticut State University. Some brief remarks by me. There were 11 SWS New England chapter members, 10 others in attendance, for a total of 21 in attendance. The 2018 annual meeting minutes were presented by Ruth Ladd. And the chapter treasurer report was read by me to the chapter, with the totals last year being 15,978 and change in our money market and checking, 14,600 and change in investments, for a total of $3,580.54. And those are has been pretty consistent. Meredith Avery reported on the awards committees, and we had talked about last year getting input for the 2020 annual meeting, and the annual meeting itself adjourned at 1:27. So like to make a motion or have somebody make a motion to accept the meeting minutes. With the webinar, it's kind of hard to
I'll make a motion to accept the minutes.
great.
Yeah.
And Ingeborg, do you want a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor? Say aye.
Well, there should be a pop-up also. That,
There should be a pop-up. There was a pop-up, folks. I did that.
All right, motion passed.
Great, thank you. So we'll take care of that piece of business. As folks saw, we had a secretary election. Ruth Ladd, who's been a long time secretary for the chapter, is stepping down after many great years of service to the chapter. And we had the election results. We had two great candidates, Samantha Walker, and I hope I don't mispronounce your name, but April Dorosky. And Samantha is an environmental scientist at the BSC Group and was a previous student grant recipient from the New England chapter. And I want to thank Samantha for her interest and willingness to throw her name into the ring for the secretary position. Opening yourself up to an election takes some bravery, and I'm glad that you did that. But we'd like you to continue to be active in the chapter. The winner of the election was April, and April is an environmental scientist at Ty and Bond. She holds a BS in environmental resources from Penn State and an MS in natural resources from University of Connecticut. And her thesis was on wetland ecosystem functions in a changing coastal landscape, effects of urban runoff, saltwater intrusion, and the rest. As someone who was also interested in coastal wetlands, that was good research. It looks very interesting. So we want to welcome you into the new role, and we can chat a little bit later on the roles and responsibilities, but thank you. I just want to let everybody know we're not in person, so it's hard to clap and everything, but I just wanted to report those results. The treasurer's report for 2020, and I'm just calling that up right now. Our treasurer is Paul McManus, and the financial status of the chapter's finances through July 31st, 2020. It is remaining pretty steady, with our money market and checking being $19,011.55, investments being $15,037.66, for total in assets of $34,049.21. That total does not include an estimated $3,000 in annual dues payments expected in October this month. So that hasn't been recorded yet, but that's the chapter's portion of the membership dues that's paid to SWS. Thank you, Paul, for serving as treasurer and providing the input. And so that's the status of the chapter's finances. And then moving along for the president's remarks, I'll keep these brief so we can move on with our program today. First, as you can see, with everything this year, with COVID making changes to pretty much all aspects of our lives, that had led to us to change this up to a virtual meeting. So as we know, we're here in the virtual meeting. This is a webinar event. As I mentioned, it's a new format to me, so it's still getting used to how this works. But we really appreciate the attendance of everybody this morning and the flexibility with this alternative format, which is really becoming the normal for 2021 and maybe beyond. We'll see. But we have some great attendance. With this format, we had about 61 registrants, which is great. We typically have about 30 when we have our in-person annual meetings. So this is a good turnout. With this format, we've also obviously changed it and truncated it. Kind of when we were planning about it, we figured a webinar of a couple of hours is about the time span that people can spend in front of their screen on a webinar. So we have the 2-hour event this year. For just want to mention for our the SWS national meeting for 2021 is still scheduled for Spokane, Washington. This past spring, I was on many calls with the board regarding the E3 event that was supposed to have occurred up in Quebec, which was going to be the annual meeting for SWS National. And, that obviously got canceled with COVID, with closed borders, et cetera. So, but the plan was to at least continue to plan for an in-person meeting in Spokane, June 1 to 4, 2021. The theme being Wetland Science 2021, Adaptation Drivers Innovation. Adaptation drives innovation. So with that, there's a call for papers. So if people have seen that and have articles, it would be great to have some good representation from folks in the New England chapter. So I just wanted to get that on everyone's agenda, on your radar screen, and let you, again, I think we're going to be seeing what happens with COVID during the winter and spring. So stay tuned. It could turn into another virtual meeting. There's been a few annual meetings and national conferences that I know have gone virtual. For our SWS New England chapter for 2021, our annual meeting and conference, we're starting the planning process. We're discussing the initial plans right now are to hold it in person in autumn 2021. We decided to delay it from our spring. We were thinking we would go back to the springtime. That seems to work pretty good. But with COVID, we felt we should delay it to give us some more time to see what happens going forward in 2021. So the plan right now is to hold it in Vermont. We've been trying to cycle through all New England states. The 2 remaining states right now in this 6-year cycle is Vermont and New Hampshire. So we're looking to hold it in Vermont. We've been talking to some folks up there. And the plan is, our initial plan right now is really to look at some older mitigation sites. We often have projects that look at mitigation, and they're often newer construction sites. And so these are some older ones to see what happens, over 20 years. Are we seeing the development in the proposed community as was planned? So that's the idea. And it would be our traditional 1 day of field visits followed by an inside session, for the conference. So that's what our plan is, and it's on a Friday. It would likely follow our typical Friday, Saturday schedule. So that's the plan for 2021. So we're starting that process. And if people have sites, projects, conference papers that they'd like to present, we'll be getting a call for papers out, and we'll get that going. The just one thing with the chat feature. If I would like to open it up to any questions or comments from members regarding the chapter and how things are going. I'm seeing some things going on in the chat with people saying hello and everything, but if anyone has any comments, questions, programs you'd like the New England chapter to host or participate in, please let me know. I'll just hold on for a minute to take a look at the chat. Okay, yep. One comment here I want to share, well, you can all see it, but the Wetlands of Distinction website is going strong, and we want to have people continue to send in applications. Okay. And I can see people are enjoying the snow for the first snow of the season here. Great. Okay, with that, let's move on. What I thought we would do here is adjourn the annual meeting, and then we can move on to the presentations. So just wondering if we can get the vote screen sent out, Emily or Tony, and if one of the panelists can make a motion to adjourn this year's annual meeting.
This is Ingeborg, so moved.
And do I have a second from Gillian?
Sure, I can second that.
Great. Okay. With that, please vote to adjourn. This is just for the business meeting portion of today's morning.
All right, everyone should have a pop-up, so if you just want to respond to that. And all right, thank you. Motion approved.
Great, excellent. And just looking at the chat, we have some. I'll just also throw a shout out to the Connecticut Association of Wetland Scientists. I made sure this event was broadcast out to them. Their meeting last spring was likewise canceled abruptly because of COVID. So great. Okay, with that, I'd like to start the program for this morning. And today's program is on the Waters of the United States rule. That's been a moving target. I've been in consulting now for 32 years, and it's with all the court cases over the years, going back to SWANK, the Solid Waste Authority of Northern Cook County, that made changes, and then another more recent one was Rapanos, and that rule came from the Supreme Court. It seems to be a moving target at the federal level, and there's some new changes. So that's what we're going to have the speakers talk about today. Our speakers, I'm going to introduce both now rather than one at a time. Then we can, the idea will be to have them speak. People can provide, type in their questions, and then we'll do a question and answer session at the end. So our two speakers are Gillian Davies and Dr. Paul Minkin. Gillian's presentation is a comparison of the April 21, 2020 final NWPR rule and prior WOTUS rules and regulations. Gillian is a professional wetland scientist and a registered soil scientist. She's a senior ecological scientist and associate at BSC Group and a visiting scholar at the Global Development Environmental Institute at Tufts, a busy young lady. Gillian, I'm just going to read their bios. I think they should be on the agenda, but in case people don't have those open. Gillian currently chairs the Society of Wetland Scientists Public Policy and Regulation section, WOTUS committee, and that's following the 3-year term on the SWS Executive Board, during which she served as president of the society from 2016 to 2017. She also serves as the president-elect for the SWS PWS certification program, and as I mentioned, is a visiting scholar at Tufts. As a consultant, she provides a broad range of ecological services and manages projects and focuses on innovative solutions, including climate change. And Gillian holds a master's in environmental studies and a BS. And Paul is talking about the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. I know Paul forwarded his slides, and where this is so new, it needs to be approved by the headquarters. So but he's using some slides that are kind of pre-approved out of the EPA. He can give you some more info. He'll give more info on that. But Paul works at the regulatory division of the New England District of the Army Corps of Engineers and the environmental resource section. He's in Concord, and he performs and reviews wetland delineations. He's working on the functional assessment methods, analyzing the functions and services of wetlands, and reviewing wetland mitigation and monitoring, and provides training. Paul also is a PWS. He's a certified senior ecologist and holds a doctorate in botany from Miami University. And he was a member of the National Advisory Team for Wetland Delineation on the Northeast, North Central Regional Supplement. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Gillian and take it away.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen here.
Oh.
Let's see. So is everybody able to see that?
Yeah, Gillian, you're a little bit quiet. I don't know if you want to get a little bit closer to your microphone.
Is that better?
A little bit.
A little bit. All right. I'll try.
Maybe Dwight was just speaking really loudly.
I do speak loudly.
Okay. So today I'm going to just go through the Navigable Waters Protection Rule and how it is different from previous regulations of waters of the United States and the changes to the definition of waters of the United States. So the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is a rule that revises the WOTUS definition. It went through a rulemaking process and was published in the Federal Register on April 21st, 2020, and became effective in June 22, 2020, throughout most of the country except for Colorado. And this new rule revises both the 2015 Clean Water Rule and the pre-2015 definitions of WOTUS. So as I mentioned, it is in effect now everywhere in the country except Colorado, where there's a court has stayed the NWPR, and that's going to work itself out through the courts. And there are challenges to the NWPR in various courts around the country, which could lead to future stays or invalidation of the NWPR, either nationally or in certain states. So stay tuned on that. The scope of the NWPR affects all aspects of the Clean Water Act. So it is not just applicable to Section 404, the wetlands section, it's applicable to the other sections as well. Also, it did not really consider or address the longstanding no net loss of wetlands national policy that's been in effect through all administrations since 1989. And the overall effect of the NWPR is to narrow the definition of waters of the United States and limit the geographic scope of the Clean Water Act. And these are some of the sections of the Clean Water Act that the agencies evaluated as they were undergoing their rulemaking process. And the NWPR does not actually appear to document how the goal of the Clean Water Act to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters is achieved. The Clean Water Act itself recognizes multi-parameter connectivity, but the rule has more limited jurisdictional connectivity. The rule provides a number of definitions to try to clarify things, and these are some of the key definitions. Perennial refers to surface water flowing continuously year-round. Intermittent refers to surface water flowing continuously during certain times of year and in more than a direct response to precipitation. And then ephemeral refers to surface water flowing or pooling only in direct response to precipitation. And snowpack refers to accumulated snow, not just a single snowfall. Typical year is an important concept in the NWPR, referring to when precipitation or other climatic variables are within the normal periodic range, and the periodic range can be seasonal or annual for a specific geographic area of that aquatic resource based on a rolling 30-year period. And a normal precipitation range is considered to be the 30th through the 70th percentile ranges for that specific date over the last 30 years for that specific geographic area. And the NWPR creates 4 classes of regulated waters, A1, A2, A3, and A4. Interstate waters have been eliminated as a separate category. They're now incorporated into some of these other categories. A big difference between the 2015 Clean Water Rule and pre-2015 jurisdiction versus the NWPR is the basis for the rules. The earlier basis was on Justice Kennedy's 2006 Rapanos significant nexus test, whereas the NWPR is based on Justice Scalia's 2006 Rapanos opinion and President Trump's February 28th, 2017 executive order instructed the agencies to undergo this rulemaking process to implement that. And now the A1 waters refer to traditional navigable waters and the territorial seas, and they're now in one single category. There aren't really any substantive changes to the definition of traditional navigable waters, although interstate waters are no longer an independent category that were jurisdictional purely because they were interstate waters. Now they're only jurisdictional if they meet conditions of another category of jurisdictional waters. So they have to be an A1 through A4 water in order to be jurisdictional. And just to quickly go over the A1 definition of TNWs and territorial seas: waters which are currently used or were used in the past or may be susceptible to use in interstate or foreign commerce, including waters which are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. The 2015 and pre-2015 rules used a functional definition of WOTUS based in science and on the ecological relationship of the water or wetland to downstream TNWs, and that had to do with the significant nexus test, and were supported by the EPA connectivity report, which was based on over 1,200 peer-reviewed articles representing the state of the science. And so in that case, some ephemeral streams were within jurisdiction, and there were a variety of different decisions about ditches. The NWPR A2 waters is A2 waters are tributaries, and they must contribute perennial or intermittent surface flow to downstream A1 waters, either directly or through A2 to A4 waters in a typical year to be jurisdictional. They can flow through a non-jurisdictional surface water, such as an ephemeral stream, and remain jurisdictional. But and then if there's an alteration or relocation of the tributary, that does not alter its regulatory status as long as it continues to meet the definition after alteration or relocation. The big take home here is that all ephemeral features are excluded from jurisdiction. There is also a reduction in jurisdictional ditches. If the ditch is constructed completely within upland, or it has ephemeral flow, it's not jurisdictional. A3 rule waters are now, they refer to lakes, ponds, and impoundments, and they're in a separate category. Before, they were not in a separate category. Now, non-navigable isolated lakes and wetlands are no longer jurisdictional due to eliminating significant nexus. Impoundments of jurisdictional waters are continued to be regulated in the same manner that they were before, but fewer waters are jurisdictional, so there will probably be fewer jurisdictional impoundments. And just to review what the A3 water, lakes, ponds, and impoundments refers to, it's standing bodies of open water contributing surface water flow to an A1 water in a typical year, either directly or through one or more of the A2 through 4 waters. It does not lose its jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water through a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water, such as an ephemeral stream. Also, it can be jurisdictional if it is inundated by flooding from an A1 through 3 water. And then A4 waters refer to adjacent wetlands. And so there's more limited jurisdiction over wetlands. Wetlands must either abut the jurisdictional water or have a direct hydrologic surface connection in a typical year, or be inundated by the jurisdictional water, with a few exceptions. It retains jurisdiction for wetlands that are physically separated by a natural berm, bank, or dune from the jurisdictional water, or by an artificial dike or barrier that connects via an artificial feature. One of the most significant changes is in the interpretation of the word adjacent. The NWPR changes the definition of adjacent by excluding the significant nexus concept and the science that supports it. In most situations, the agencies have also excluded 3 out of the 4 of the dictionary definitions for adjacent. And those that are excluded are next to lie near, or close to. And it limits the meaning of adjacent just to the dictionary definitions of adjoining or abutting. And with those couple of exceptions there where they still can have the natural berm, bank, dune separation, or the artificial dike or barrier if there's an artificial hydrologic connection. And then let's see, okay. So to go over that definition of A4 waters, adjacent wetlands a little bit more, it means they abut, which means they have to touch at least at one point or side of an A1 through 3 water, or they're inundated by flooding from one of those A1 through 3 waters in a typical year, or they are just separated by those natural features that I mentioned, or the artificial features that have a hydrologic connection. The NWPR provides a number of new definitions and many redefinitions of existing terms. So this is just a side-by-side comparison of how the term adjacent got redefined, as I just mentioned. And so the end result of this redefinition of adjacent is that some types of wetlands that have an ecological connection to waters of the United States are now excluded, and that full meaning of the Clean Water Act of multi-parameter connectivity, chemical, physical, and biological integrity is not, doesn't appear to be fully met. In terms of delineating wetlands, the wetland delineation methodology is unchanged. So the 3-parameter approach, the continued use of the wetland delineation manual, all of that so far is unchanged. And the one thing is that certain areas will lose jurisdiction because WOTUS has been redefined. In New England, the most likely wetlands to be impacted would be vernal pools, ephemeral headwater streams, and some types of ditches. So as I mentioned, the proposed rule changes that understanding of connectivity, and that has ramifications for field assessment. They wanted to eliminate the case-specific significant nexus tests. And they have done that, but they do, the NWPR now needs case-specific site analysis and inclusion of complex and professional level site evaluations to determine jurisdiction in a number of situations, such as, is it an ephemeral stream or is it intermittent? That's going to take professional level evaluation a lot of the time. And so that could involve analysis of duration of flow and origin of flow for those distinctions of the type of stream or river that it is. Ditches that term means a constructed or excavated channel used to convey water, and they are jurisdictional when they themselves are traditional navigable water, including those subject to ebb and flow of the tide. In other words, they meet the definition of an A1 water, and an example of that would be the Erie Canal. That will continue to be jurisdictional. Ditches are also jurisdictional if they're constructed in or relocate a tributary or are constructed in an adjacent wetland, and they must, after those construction and relocation activities, they must continue to satisfy the flow conditions of the tributary definition. So they have to either meet the A2 water definition or the A4 water. But if they meet the A4 water definition, it means they were constructed in an adjacent wetland and have developed wetland characteristics. So the ditch definition now codifies that ditches constructed in uplands other than traditional navigable waters or rerouted tributaries, and certain ditches constructed in wetlands and ditches with ephemeral flow are not jurisdictional. And if this still seems a little confusing, one thing you can do is go to the EPA and Corps websites. They have some memorandum that are explaining how to figure these things out and clarify, provide a little more detail on clarifications. Their memo on ditch exemptions was issued on July 27th, 2020. And it includes this flow chart. And don't worry about trying to read the the fine print here. I just wanted to let you know that this helpful flow chart exists, and you can find it on the agency's website. And then I just wanted to talk a bit about the features or waters that are excluded from the WOTUS definition. They have 12 exclusions that they list. Waters that are not listed as WOTUS, groundwater ephemeral features, diffuse stormwater runoff, ditches not identified as WOTUS, prior converted cropland, artificially irrigated areas, artificial lakes and ponds, water-filled depressions incidental to mining or construction activity, stormwater control features, groundwater recharge, water reuse, and wastewater recycling structures, and waste treatment systems. So another definition that is a new definition is the term upland, which means any land area that under normal circumstances does not satisfy all 3 wetland factors identified in paragraph C16, and also does not lie below ordinary high water mark or the high tide line of a jurisdictional wetland. And features constructed or excavated in an upland or in non-jurisdictional waters must be constructed wholly in the upland or non-jurisdictional water to meet the applicable exclusions. And so the exclusions that need to be in these non-jurisdictional upland areas or waters are artificial lakes and ponds, water-filled depressions incidental to mining or construction activity, stormwater control features, groundwater recharge, water reuse and wastewater recycling, and waste treatment systems. So certain excluded features can convey surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year, and they can serve as that connection, but they're not jurisdictional themselves, and that's just something to be aware of. And this is a side-by-side comparison of exclusions from jurisdiction through the different iterations of WOTUS rules and regulations. The NWPR maintains existing codified exclusions. It also codifies some existing exclusions that have been maintained by practice but are not codified or were not codified, and then adds some new additional exclusions. So you can see the pre-2015 codified exclusions on the left, I guess that would be on the left of your screen, and then how the 2015 Clean Water Rule changed things. Well, on this slide, it's ones that they maintained those pre-2015 exclusions. The NWPR maintained those specific exclusions on the right on the screen. They added a new definition and explanation for prior converted cropland, and they defined waste treatment systems for the first time and added that all components are included, including lagoons, settling basins, and cooling ponds. And again, we have the side-by-side comparison. This time on the left with the pre-2015 rules, there were a number of features that were excluded by practice but were not codified. The 2015 Clean Water Rule codified some of those exclusions and then maintained by practice others that were still not codified. The NWPR maintains those 2015 exclusions, but clarified that groundwater drained through subsurface drainage systems is an exclusion, and clarified that stormwater management systems constructed in uplands or in non-jurisdictional waters are excluded. And this slide has the same exclusion by practice info as the prior slide, just so you can compare it to the newly codified exclusions. So the NWPR codified some of these things that were excluded by practice but weren't codified, and then added mining to the list of the list of activities where water-filled depressions in uplands that were incidental to that activity are excluded. So mining had previously not been on that list. And on this slide, you can see the evolution of codification, and the NWPR newly codified exclusions include some that are different from prior regulations. The ephemeral features, interstate waters that do not meet jurisdictional requirements in the other categories, non-navigable isolated lakes and ponds, impoundments within newly excluded waters, wetlands that are physically separated from jurisdictional waters and lack the direct hydrologic surface connection, or are not inundated by jurisdictional waters in a typical year, although there are those couple of exceptions that I already mentioned, and ditches in uplands. And then the NWPR wanted to make a clear distinction between waters subject to federal authority and those under the sole control of states and tribes by limiting federal regulation and including more categorical jurisdiction and provision of additional definitions. Previous to NWPR, states and tribes had the choice to assume responsibility for Section 404 permitting. Only 2 states chose to do so. 21 states had dredge and fill permit programs, and many were relying on federal grant funding and collaboration to implement that, and the federal technical expertise and financial support. And all states except for Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Mexico had administered parts of Section 402. So they had more, states and tribes had more flexibility under the prior regulations than they do now. Under the NWPR, states will be the sole entities with the ability to protect waters that the federal government now excludes from jurisdiction, and will have to shoulder that burden regardless of whether or not they have the resources to do so. However, many states have laws restricting state jurisdictions such that state law is not permitted to be more protective of resources than federal law. So in these states, the loss of the federal protection necessitates a subsequent loss of state protection. The agency's proposition that states will take over responsibility for regulation of excluded waters and wetlands is not likely to be feasible in many cases, whether due to state level legal restrictions or simply because the state does not have the financial resources. And I would like to thank my fellow members of the SWS Public Policy and Regulations Section WOTUS Ad Hoc Committee who contributed to the content of this PowerPoint, and to SWS's comment letters during the rulemaking process for the NWPR. And some of the changes that we recommended in those comment letters did in fact seem to be included in the final rule. So I think that we did have some effect there. And I especially want to say a shout out to Ruth Ladd, who not only served for many years of service to the chapter, but also she brought her extensive years of experience and expertise with the Corps of Engineers to our WOTUS Ad Hoc Committee, and we really greatly appreciate that. So thank you very much. And now I will pass the screen on to Dwight, I think, and I have to stop sharing my screen. I have to figure out how to
I
do that.
stopped it on your behalf, Gillian, if you're okay.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Yes, our next speaker is Paul Minkin with the Corps, as I mentioned. But before that, I would like Ingeborg to just make a few brief comments. Actually, I'm looking on the participants list to see if Ruth Ladd has joined.
No, I don't see it. So we have to wait.
Yeah, she's going to join around. She thought she could join around 11. So why don't we move on to Paul? And for the agenda, you can make your remarks after Paul's presentation. Take it away, Paul.
Okay, so far you've got me. I'm trying to share my screen, which hopefully will be up soon.
And Paul, while you're doing that, I'll just mention that keep the questions coming, and the plan is after Paul's presentation, we'll do the Q&A session, so we can address those questions as they come up. All right.
Okay. Hopefully you're seeing the presentation. See if I can get it actually into presentation mode and it still stays with you. Okay, can everyone still see that?
Yep, we're all set.
Yes, success.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Nice to chat with you on this nice snowy day. First off, I'd like to thank Gillian for basically covering all the main parts of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the NWPR, or as we've started calling in our office, NWPR, so that I don't have to go into that in as much depth. What I will do is I'll sort of go through some of the same things, but what I'm going to emphasize is how we're so far seeing this play out in New England. What areas are being changed as far as jurisdiction and how that's working out. You already saw this. Basically, there's 4 categories of jurisdictional waters. The territorial seas, traditional navigable waters, again, have been combined into one. Tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters and adjacent wetlands. And then there's also the 12 categories of non-jurisdictional waters, which I'll talk about a little bit later in a little slightly more detail. Some of the key changes, and again, this is something that Gillian's talked about, a lot of these, so I'm going to go through them very quickly. The 4 categories of jurisdictional waters, again, they combine the traditional navigable waters and territorial seas. Interstate waters are no longer categorically jurisdictional. So again, this means that any waterways, including rivers, ponds that cross state boundaries in the past were automatically jurisdictional. That's no longer the case. They may still be jurisdictional as an A2 water or as an A3 water or something else, but they're no longer automatically jurisdictional simply by that. So far, I don't think we've run across any obvious ones that have lost jurisdiction, but there's certainly some that may have done so in that. We're no longer doing the case-by-case significant nexus determinations. Those were really only there during the implementation of Rapanos guidance. Prior to that, we did not have that type of analysis. So that's sort of that in-between time. We use significant nexus. Tributaries must be perennial or intermittent. All ephemeral streams are non-jurisdictional. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in a bit and some of the ones that we're seeing. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments must contribute surface water to traditional navigable waters in a typical year, and wetlands must be directly abutting a TNW, tributary, lake, pond, or impoundment to be jurisdictional or adjacent. Some of the new terms are defined there, and again, Gillian went through some of that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. The A1 waters, again, these are the traditional navigable waters. Those are subject to ebb and flow of the tide. There's really no change essentially in the jurisdiction of these areas in our part of the world. I don't think there's many changes anywhere. There may be in some situations, but we're not really seeing that here. The A2 waters are the tributaries, and these are a river stream or similar naturally occurring. And naturally occurring we're using here, and that's going to be different from the ditch situation. Some ditches, as you've seen, are jurisdictional, some are not. But this is looking at naturally occurring surface water channels that contribute surface water flow to an A1 water in a typical year, either directly or indirectly through an A2, 3, or 4 waters. So it's got that contribute surface water flow. So that means it has to have water flow that eventually goes out to an A1 water. And in a typical year, that concept is going to be important for a lot of the jurisdictional features. So looking at a typical year, for instance, this past summer, at least certainly here in my part of Massachusetts, was not a typical season. It was much, much drier than normal. So in looking at that, we would need additional data to determine how things might be in a typical year. But having the droughts or excessively wet periods are going to, we'll have to look at a broader range to determine what would be the situation in a typical year. Okay, a tributary must be perennial or intermittent. Again, Gillian mentioned the ephemeral systems are no longer jurisdictional. In some cases, we have not looked at all ephemeral systems as jurisdictional in the past anyway. Some of them, however, have been considered jurisdictional. So in this case, the break in the respondent's guidance, we were looking at a break as far as whether significant nexus was needed to do between perennial and intermittent, or whether it was a long-term intermittent versus a short-term intermittent, the so-called relatively permanent waters. Here, the break is between intermittent and ephemeral. Intermittent and perennial streams are essentially treated the same. As long as they flow through to an A1 water, they're considered jurisdictional. The ephemeral ones are considered non-jurisdictional. And again, ephemeral is based on a single or several very close together precipitation events, whereas the intermittent and perennial, there's more flow than just a very brief, precipitation event, be it snow or rain. A tributary, the alteration or relocation of the tributary does not modify its jurisdictional status as long as it continues to satisfy the flow conditions of the definition. So in other words, if someone is relocating a stream, there may be a construction project, they need to move the stream around that. That stream does not lose jurisdiction simply by its movement, as long as it continues to flow in a typical year and contribute water to the A1 waters downstream. Tributary does not lose jurisdictional status if it's channelized as a surface water feature, or if it goes through a non-jurisdictional feature. There are a number of non-jurisdictional features that are mentioned in the regulation, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those because some are common in our area, some are not. But simply going through that, as long as the waters from the tributary you're looking at make it to the A1 waters, then they're still considered jurisdictional. Term tributary can include ditches that either relocate a tributary or constructed in a tributary or constructed in adjacent wetlands, as long as it continues to meet those flow definitions requirements. Contribution of surface water flow. The challenge is it contributes to the flow directly to an A1 water in a typical year. Okay, the typical year, and this is one of the buzz terms of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Term typical year means when precipitation and other climatic variables are within the normal periodic range, e.g. seasonally, annually, for the geographic area of the applicable aquatic resource based on a rolling 30-year period. So this is what we're now using to determine, was this summer really dry? It felt dry, but was it truly dry? And we look at the precipitation during the 3-month period prior to analysis and look at it over the 30-year rolling averages period to determine, is it wetter than normal, drier than normal, or normal? Is it a typical year for that to make that determination? Simply knowing whether it's dry, typical, or wet, we can look at multiple resources to determine what would be the typical year. Hopefully we'll have data, be it gauge data, water monitoring, groundwater monitoring, aerial photography, other types of resources over multiple years to try and get at what's the typical year one. There are new definitions. The term perennial surface water flowing continuously year-round, intermittent surface water flowing continuously during certain times of the year, and more than in direct response to precipitation. Ephemeral is the surface water flowing or pooling only in direct response to precipitation. For instance, many of us are seeing snow today, some are seeing rain today. This snow, we don't expect to be here long term. It's going back into the 60s, I know, in my area in a few days. So this snow's going to be gone probably shortly after it falls. This is not snowpack. So this is a single snow event. As the snow melts, we may see little rivulets flowing in areas. That's going to be simply intermittent flow in most cases. It's just a result of this particular snow rain event there. So those are ephemeral systems. The intermittent is when more than that single event is happening. They consider also a single event several short-term events happening together. For instance, if we had 3 major rainstorms within a week, that would generally still be considered all part of a single precipitation event in this, in the rule for determining whether or not that's a typical, more than ephemeral flow for that. The rule does not specify certain flow volumes or flow duration metrics, as a time period that encompasses intermittent flow can vary widely across the country based upon climate, hydrology, topography, soils, and other conditions. So this is important to remember because this is where we have some ability to sort of analyze what's going on there. Is this single one-day event something that's more than ephemeral? Does it take more than a week to be more than ephemeral? But that's something, again, looking at what we're actually seeing here, the flow dynamics typical in New England and in different parts of New England, north, south, different elevations. We're going to see different flow patterns to some degree. Intermittent flow, again, flows continuously during certain times of the year, more than in direct response to precipitation. Groundwater is not a requirement to be intermittent. Now, that's something in the past, at least I know in our district, we typically looked at determining something if it was intermittent. One of the things I would always look for is, does it have base flow? Does it have flow based on the groundwater discharge at some point during its cycle? Not just including it, but essentially maintaining that stream there. That's not required here. It can actually include artificial sources such as effluent as part of what is considered the flow regime. I'm not sure how that helps the water quality aspect, but the effluent is considered part of flow. And if there's consistent discharge, then that would be more than an ephemeral event. So it would be intermittent or could even be perennial in some cases. Snowpack, I want to talk just a little bit about because that's something that we do have here in New England, certainly in parts of New England. And it's also something that there's been some questions amongst the core districts. We have set up division implementation teams that are looking at applying consistently different aspects of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And these division teams have gone to headquarters with various questions looking at how do we assess this part of it? What's the right answer? You know, it wasn't clear from the regulation, whatever. Snowpack's one of the things we've talked about a little bit. Term snowpack is defined as layers of snow that accumulate over extended periods of time in certain geographic areas, blah, blah, blah. We know where those geographic areas are here. What we're seeing today is not going to be part of the snowpack unless our weather changes dramatically from what the current prediction is over the next couple of weeks. But it's, you know, those of you who work in higher elevations or just simply parts of northern New England know that, you know, there's a certain point, even here in Massachusetts, there have been some winters after that first snow, we're not snow free again for several months. And that's sort of where they're talking about the snowpack. It's not a single snowfall melt that we're looking at the discharge from. It's not from that just single, it's from continuous flow and melting. And that's sort of what we're, you know, continuous layers of snow built up, and then the slow melting in the spring of multiple snow events. So that's what we're looking at, snowpack, that continuous melting in the spring of multiple snow events. That's considered intermittent flow, not ephemeral. In some cases, we're looking at, as spring happens, a lot of systems are connected by that intermittent flow. You know, these wetland depressional areas, flows out, may flow through intermittent streams themselves or through non-jurisdictional conveyances out to the A1 waters. Ephemeral versus intermittent, again, that's the main break here. It's not intermittent and perennial are treated the same in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, unlike the way they were under the Rapanos guidance. Here, the break is between ephemeral and intermittent. Term ephemeral means surface water flowing pool only in direct response to precipitation. And that's, again, individual rainfall or snow events. And it can, again, be more than just that one day or one storm. If you have multiple storms in a short period of time, that can still considered a single event there. The seasonal flow versus continuous flow. Seasonal flow is something that's, you know, weeks or months long. This is, again, where snow melts. Also, it's simply in the spring before we have the leaves out and evapotranspiration is really ramped up. With every precipitation event, we have more water that flows across the surface rather than being pulled into the vegetation. So that provides a source of flow that's sort of more than an ephemeral flow, but it's seasonal because once the leaves come out, the plants start pumping the water through their systems, evapotranspiration starts rising, then we don't see that type of flow later in the season. Non-jurisdictional connections. A tributary does not lose its jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through the following features. And these are talking about features that are themselves non-jurisdictional by this rule. They go underground. They're considered not surface waters. They're non-jurisdictional by the rule, but because they convey those what would otherwise be jurisdictional waters down to eventually the A1 waters, that in-between system does not become jurisdictional, but the upstream system retains jurisdiction through that. And that includes, it's basically a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature such as an ephemeral stream, a non-jurisdictional ditch, subterranean river. We don't have a lot of those here. In areas with karst topography, you would find something more like that. Culverts, dams, tunnels, or similar artificial features we have lots and lots of in New England. There's been lots of confusion and controversy over culverts themselves, that the culvert itself may be non-jurisdictional, but certainly the stream, upstream and downstream, again, assuming they have the appropriate flow in a typical year, are considered jurisdictional. Debris piles, boulder fields. We have a lot of boulder fields in New England. The glaciers were very effective at dropping them everywhere and washing out of them and so on. But we do have boulder fields in these. We don't have surface flow in a lot of situations. The water flows down at the base of the boulders, sometimes under the systems there, but it's this discrete flow. It's not the groundwater. It's this upstream stream that now has sort of moved out into a boulder field. We've lost a channel, but it coalesces again at the bottom of that boulder field and continues as a stream downstream. So those areas are still jurisdictional, not within the boulder field, but the upstream and downstream sections of those, as long as they maintain an appropriate flow in a typical year. Just want to throw that in there. You'll have heard it about 800 times by the end of today. Sorry about that. There are connections that sever jurisdiction, though. I just talked about some of these non-jurisdictional conveyances that maintain jurisdiction. Here's some that will sever it. Stream channel breaks that do not contribute surface flow to downstream waters in a typical year. It could be that at this point, it's simply too little flow. It may only occur once in 50 years or 100 years, so that's not going to be a typical flow. It may dissipate on the surface in a sheet flow and not really coalesce back into something below, so that sheet flow itself is considered not even a conveyance. That's not just a non-jurisdictional conveyance. It's really not considered a conveyance. Surface stream channels that disappear underground and become part of the groundwater aquifer. Don't think we have a lot of these here, but we may have some. And so again, once they disappear and actually join, unlike flowing just through a boulder field, they're actually joining the groundwater aquifer. At that point, they've lost jurisdiction as a surface water. Everyone's favorite question, are ditches tributaries? And the answer is sometimes not. Again, the term tributary includes a ditch that either relocates a tributary, is constructed in a tributary, or is constructed in an adjacent wetland, as long as the ditch satisfies the flow conditions of this definition. The flow conditions are that it has to be at least intermittent in a typical year and connect eventually to an A1 water. We have lots of ditches in New England. Some of them are jurisdictional or under this rule, some of them are not. Really, a lot of them, we may have to look at the history of construction of it. Was it constructed originally in a jurisdictional feature, such as an adjacent wetland? Was it constructed in a non-jurisdictional feature, a type of wetland that maybe during construction was considered a jurisdictional wetland, but under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is not considered a jurisdictional wetland, and therefore would be considered not constructed in a jurisdictional wetland and would be non-jurisdictional. The ditches are not a standalone category. I just sort of went over that already. When is a ditch a water of the U.S.? It can be a traditional navigable water that includes things, and maybe that's what when Gillian was talking about the Erie Canal, or it can also be in situations where they're constructing tidal areas. We don't have a lot of that here in this part of the country, but if you think about, for instance, Florida, where they have canals dug all over the residential areas so that people can have boats in their backyards, those are in many cases tidal waters. So those ditches, while dug out of land, I'm not sure if it's upland or not down there, dug out of land, were not, it's still, they maintain the ebb and flow of the tide in those situations. So those would be jurisdictional. And again, if it's constructed in adjacent wetlands and develops wetland characteristics. When are lakes, ponds, and impoundments jurisdictional? These are A3 waters, and they have to, one, they can be part of the territorial sea or TNW if parts of that have been either impounded or dug out of. It's an A3 water if they contribute surface water flow to an A1 water in typical years through one or more A2. It's the same thing over again that we were hearing about tributaries, is it? Or are inundated by flooding from the A1, A2, A3 water typical year. That is, if the stream floods, that back floods into this pond system, that is that's a characteristic that will pull that pond into jurisdiction because it's exchanging water with that stream that eventually goes to the A1 water. So it's either if the pond itself contributes flow, or if it's inundated by flooding from the adjacent A1 through A3 water, A3, 4, I guess, water, then that's considered the appropriate connection for the lake, pond, or impoundment to be jurisdictional. Also for impoundments, they must be impoundments of jurisdictional waters to meet the A3 criteria above. If it's an impoundment of a non-jurisdictional water, for instance, an impoundment of an ephemeral stream, it does not become jurisdictional even if that waterway, if the pond itself has water in it year round, it may discharge water, and it's possible, I guess, it could even discharge at an intermittent level. Because it was constructed in non-jurisdictional waters, it remains non-jurisdictional. Important features to think about here in New England: kettle ponds, kettle bogs. If they do not have some connection via a stream, ditch, some conveyance that's considered appropriate for this, or are back flooded by a nearby A1 through A3 water, these systems, if they're truly isolated, are now non-jurisdictional. So that is another change in New England. Typically, ponds, great ponds, things like that have generally been jurisdictional. Many of them do have surface water connections, which may retain their jurisdiction. The ones that are truly isolated are now non-jurisdictional, regardless of their size here. So that's a change to think about in some of the systems we have. Adjacent wetlands, again, adjacent means abutting. That Gillian went through some of the definitions of plain definitions of adjacent in the dictionary and all. Core regulations have defined adjacent in the past as bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. Bordering and contiguous have always meant touching in some way the waterway. The neighboring, however, always meant not touching. So it was something, a form of adjacency that clearly was intended in that regulation, the older regulation, to mean it was it was adjacent, even though it was just neighboring. That's gone now as far as a link for jurisdiction. Things have to actually be touching to be considered jurisdictional. They can be in it, so they have to be either touching that A1 through A3 water. They can be inundated by flooding from the A1 through A3 water, just as I described for the ponds. It's the same thing. If that nearby A1 through A3 water does not touch the wetland, but it floods into it during a typical year, then that's something that would be a link for jurisdiction for that to be considered adjacent. And then there can be physical separation of the wetland from the adjacent A1 through A3 waters, and that's either the natural berm, bank, dune, or similar feature, or an artificial dike, barrier, or similar artificial structure, so long as that structure allows for direct hydrologic surface connection between the wetlands and the A1 through 3 water in a typical year. Again, it has to allow for that connection. If something is separating a wetland, say a road goes in between through a wetland, and you've got the wetland on the upstream and the downstream portion, if there's no culvert, if there's no regular over-the-road flooding, if there's essentially built so that the upper portions of that wetland no longer contribute hydrologically to the lower portions of that wetland, which are connected to the A1 waters, that upper portion has now become non-jurisdictional. So for the artificial separations, there has to be a connection, a hydrologic connection through. It certainly can be a human-made one, but it has to be connected through that. And that can include, as I said, regular overflooding of the road in a typical year. What are wetlands? As Gillian pointed out, the definition of wetlands has not changed. The way we identify wetlands, the delineation methods are the same. None of that has changed, just simply the methods of jurisdiction. Basically, identifying wetlands, jurisdictional wetlands or other aquatic resources is a two-phase approach. The first is determining, is it an aquatic resource? In other words, is it a wetland, a pond, stream, whatever it might be. The second part is it jurisdictional? So the first part we're doing the same way we always have, identifying, is this an aquatic resource? The second part is what's different now. in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. They have added this definition of upland, and again, Gillian did a nice job talking about that. It basically just lacks the three factors. Exclusions versus exemptions. There are 12 exclusions in there. An exclusion eliminates certain waters from the definition of waters of the U.S. The excluded waters are not jurisdictional as waters of the U.S. So exclusion is talking about specific types of aquatic resources which are non-jurisdictional. Exemptions talk about the discharges that are exempt from Clean Water Act jurisdiction. So they're kind of going at sort of that second step of things. For instance, Section 404F talks about various discharges that are exempt from requiring permits. For instance, certain agricultural activities and all. These are exemptions. The exclusions aim at specific aquatic resources which are no longer considered jurisdictional. An exclusion has the resource which is not regulated. An exemption is the activity is not regulated. Any activity in these excluded waters does not require authorization from the Corps. Again, there's the four categories of the of what is jurisdictional under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Territorial seas, traditional navigable waters, tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and adjacent wetlands. The non-jurisdictional waters, there's 12 categories of those. Again, Gillian did a nice job sort of going through all those. I'd like to point out the first one, the waters not listed as WOTUS. In this case, basically, if an aquatic resource does not meet A1 through A4, it simply is considered non-jurisdictional. Even if it doesn't meet any of the 2 through 12 exclusions, the first one is sort of the catch-all. If it's not something that can be identified as waters of the U.S. under A1 through A4, then it's B1. Now, the directions we have are basically to try and get the clearest reason for being exclusion. So if it's something that meets B3 or B4 or B5, we look at those first. But if it's simply it doesn't meet B2 through B12, but also doesn't meet A1 through A4, then it's non-jurisdictional. It's B1, waters not listed as waters of the U.S. For them to be jurisdictional, they have to be specifically called out in A1 through A4. Exclusion overview. Here's one of the changes in that prior converted cropland has been excluded for many, many years in different ways. There have been some differences in how prior converted cropland is defined in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And it's actually a fairly large change. In the past, it was restricted to areas that were being maintained in certain agricultural processes. Now they've expanded the definition of agricultural processes to include things like wildlife management and some other things that are all listed in the rule. So it's not simply growing a crop on a regular basis. There's a lot of things. It's not certainly any activity that can occur, but it has been greatly expanded as to what's considered prior converted cropland. Because it's been changed so dramatically, it's not always in tune with NRCS's definition of prior converted cropland for Food Security Act reasons. It's important for anyone who's working within both the Clean Water Act and the Food Security Act to contact both the Corps and NRCS to make sure that they're doing the right things for each. Something that might be not require authorization from us may require authorization from NRCS and reverse. So that's something that's also changed with the new rule. Definition of typical year. Basically, it's defines when precipitation of the climatic varies within the normal periodic range. Gillian talked about it. I talked about it. This is a key concept for establishing jurisdiction for many things. Connections have to be in a typical year. Flow has to be in a typical year. So it's important for many of the aspects of determining jurisdiction under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. What is that typical year? Too wet or too dry? provides a predictable framework for approximately interpret data when determining the jurisdictional status of certain water bodies. Applies to some of the requirements for the following ones. The tributaries, again, they have to flow and be connected in a typical year. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments have to be connected in a typical year. Adjacent wetlands have to be abutting and connected through in a typical year. For determining typical year, they talk about the 30-day precipitation events, looking at the standard deviation to the 70th, 30th percentiles. Also, there's, do I have, nope. We developed a tool online. There's still working on it. Some folks have used it. Some there's still some bugs, I guess, being worked out of it. But the APT, suddenly it's left my mind. Something antecedent precipitation tool. So that the APT, it's online, available for use on EPA's website. It's something that's sort of been developed between the agencies. I think the Corps did the nuts and bolts of the development. EPA probably funded and hosted its development. But that's a tool that's you can punch in locations and time periods you're looking at, and it can give you a call on whether or not that was a typical year. Say you're looking at some aerial photography, were those taken during a typical year? And it can give you some information on that. Again, John listed all the other programs, the other parts of the Clean Water Act that are affected by this. This does not only affect the Section 404. Implementation of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Basically, these slides, I guess, can go into the question, or rather can go into the recordation of this. So it's something you can sort of read on your own. I think I've probably already gone over my time. But I just wanted to show you there are efforts out there of bringing together existing remote information and developing new to help make some of these determinations for intermittent flow versus perennial, or typical year versus atypical year, and so on. Again, just looking at the different resources that are out there for determining inundation by flooding, since again, that's one of the things that can call an area as jurisdictional if it's inundated by flooding. Since the Navigable Waters Rule was put out, there have been 4 implementation memos to the agencies. And this basically is to help the agencies with additional guidance to work with each other in the cases of this elevation information between the Corps and EPA, or looking at the Food Security Act versus Clean Water Act implementations of prior converted cropland between NRCS and the Corps is there, and then just dealing with ditches to identify, looking at construction and maintenance of irrigation ditches, maintenance of drainage ditches, and how best to treat those. So that's implementation guidance that's out there for the agencies. I believe those are posted on EPA's website. If you're looking for information on the Clean Water Act, including this presentation, or this has been edited down for the time period, and more, EPA's website hosts most of that. The Corps has a little bit, but a lot of what they do is they send you to EPA's website. So just if you're looking for info, that's probably the best spot to get some more of that. And I believe that is it for there for my comments. And if I can finally get out of here. I'll send this back to Dwight if you wanted to have some questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. This perfect timing. I know I had sent you a message trying to wrap up around 11:40, so that's great. Just to make sure we had plenty of time for questions and answers. I see on the chat that there's been some questions there going along during the presentations, and also a couple of other questions that came up straight through the Q&A tab. Why don't we do the first 2 questions off the Q&A tab, and then we can bring up some of the topics that are in the chat as well. So the first question that we had here was from April. Do sites that were previously jurisdictional, for example, isolated wetland, but are now non-jurisdictional, get grandfathered in terms of permitting requirements, like compensatory mitigation monitoring? So I think the question there is, you know, how where there has been a change, if you've started permitting, how that affects the permitting process. Paul, you
Well,
have
that's good. That's a good question. Let's see. It depends, I guess, at what stage the project is at. If it's something that's already been authorized, the project's been done, they've been monitoring the mitigation for a few years, they would just basically continue with that. If this is something, for instance, that we're still in the review process to determine whether it's authorized or not, then that would be a time they could request from us, we want what's called an approved jurisdictional determination. We have a couple different ways of documenting jurisdiction. One's a preliminary jurisdictional determination. This is one where basically we identify the aquatic resources out there, and the assumption is that they're all jurisdictional. The reason for doing that is it saves time on the part of the applicant. They're not going through all of that. If the state already has jurisdiction for those resources, they often don't care if we do as well, because it's going to be the same amount of time, amount of mitigation, everything, either way. So that's one reason they kind of just like go along with that. However, if an area is likely to be non-jurisdictional and people want to impact that area, then they may want to ask us for an approved jurisdictional determination. That's the only thing we can give in writing that actually says this area is non-jurisdictional. So if folks have a project they've been planning, already came to us for jurisdictional determination, or asked about areas that were jurisdictional a few years ago, and they still haven't done the work, they may want to come back to us and say, hey, we looked at this in the past, it was jurisdictional, is it still? Now, as far as something in process where they've already received the permit, doing the project, or in the process of doing the project now, I'm trying to remember. Basically, they should come and talk to us. I don't know if I've seen clear guidance from headquarters on how we deal with those that are kind of in the midst of the process. Early on, we can certainly look at updating the jurisdictional determination. Later on, at that point, it's really not worth doing that. But some of those ones in between, they should certainly at least talk to us about that. Also, one thing I'd just like to say in general is basically the Corps and EPA are the only people, organization, whatever, that can identify Clean Water Act jurisdiction in this case. So don't necessarily assume based on a very short instruction that you've heard today that something is or is not jurisdictional, because there are areas that you may think are non-jurisdictional, which are, or vice versa. But don't presume. It's still, I think, safest for you at least to come and talk to us. What I recommend to people is if you're sending us a delineation, identify all the aquatic resources. Don't say jurisdictional or not, because you can't make that claim. You can say, I think this is jurisdictional and this is why. And then we can give you the call. And then that way you're safest because you have something in writing from us saying yay or nay on these systems.
Great. There was another written question from Mike Sheehan, directed to Paul, but evidence of ordinary OHWM can be subtle, particularly with seasonal intermittent tributaries. He suggests that OHWM deserves careful analysis when determining adjacency. It is not necessarily a function of growing season events. Many wetlands are flooded and covered with ice during the winter, and that surface is continuous all the way to an intermittent tributary. Just wondering your comment is on that.
Well, first off, Mike, you'll be very happy to know that I have been putting forward that winter flow over ice and snow as part of the adjacency and snowpack with the division implementation team. So far, and because it is division, North Atlantic Division, most of the other district folks do have areas with snowpack at some point during the year. So that seems to be the general acceptance of those areas. Now, seeing them and identifying them at the wrong times of the year are always going to be a problem. So we're looking at how we can best try and maybe develop tools to do that. Also, at the national level, our Engineering Research and Development Center has been developing work on ordinary high water mark, workbooks, trainings, and other things. So they're going a lot more into detail. They're doing a lot more work starting out west, where those issues are more impactful, I guess, than in the east. But it is something that we are getting more information available to do that with the ordinary high water marks.
And one of the questions from Adam Crary is the Corps EPA looking at a stream flow regime field assessment method being developed for New England, similar to other states like North Carolina or Virginia?
There are stream assessment methods they're looking at. The one that has been tested in our district is the SVAP, which is something I believe that NRCS had development issues with. So it's not the same as the stuff in Virginia and North Carolina. I was not directly involved in that. Did Ruth Ladd ever make it onto the call?
Yes, she did.
Ruth was involved in the field testing with the SVAP. So if we want to put her on the spot, again, it's something that's not fully implemented by us, but that's the direction we were heading in as far as the stream assessment thing. So if Ruth wants to say something about that, at least can talk about her experience with it.
Hi, yeah, I'm on. If you can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's an assessment method, but it's not so much to determine if something is ephemeral or intermittent, which I think is what the question was about, if I understand it. So it's more the how healthy the stream is and ecologically. And it does talk about flow and that kind of thing, but it doesn't distinguish. It wouldn't be useful in that for that particular purpose, I don't think. Unless I've forgotten everything in the last 16 months or so.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, if it's something we're developing, we don't have anything at present. We're specifically developing to identify that break between ephemeral and intermittent. That doesn't mean we're not going to be. We just haven't at this point.
Right. Okay. So there's been some discussion going on the chat, and kind of directed this to Gillian. There's a comment from Matt Schweisberg, about the development of this rule not necessarily being a scientific rule and not following along, not having much public process. So I'm just wondering what comments you have, Gillian, on that, and maybe from the SWS committee that
Sure.
worked on comments.
Yeah, and the NWPR did not include a review of the best available science in the way that the development of the 2015 Clean Water Rule did. For the 2015 Clean Water Rule, the agencies produced a connectivity report. That's generally what it's called. And it was based on review of 1,200 peer-reviewed scientific articles that represented the best available science. And so that rule was very much based on the science that it would, for what kind of a rule would it take to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That the Clean Water Act, plain language, is that act passed by Congress, the intent, the goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So it's 3-parameter connectivity, and the NWPR does really not respond to that. It's not supported by science in the way that the 2015 Clean Water Rule was. And there was no comparable body of science that was pulled together, produced a report to support the new rule. And they didn't make any attempt to discuss how do they meet the goal of the Clean Water Act, which is the governing act. And the connectivity that's included in the NWPR is very narrow. It's you know, primarily based on the surface water, so just the hydrologic connection, and it does not account for the multi-parameter connectivity referenced in the act itself. So that's many of the scientific societies, including SWS and the Consortium of Aquatic Science Societies, as well as Ecological Science, the Ecological Society of America, the American Institute of Biological Sciences. We submitted comment letters during the comment period to this effect, and much of what we commented on was not incorporated into the final rule. There were a few things that were changed for the better, but a lot of it was not incorporated. The other thing is, for the 2015 Clean Water Rule, that one had, I think, over 200 days of public comment. So there was a very lengthy period of time for a full public process, full public comments from all sides. Everybody could comment. And whereas the NWPR had a much more limited, I think it was just 60 days for a comment period, which is actually, that's not a lot of time when a lot of people are trying to comment on top of their regular jobs and coordinate comments and check things and, you know, reference things with scientific references. So the public process was not consistent with past practice. And I think that's something that's important to understand about it, that it just, it's really not supported by science the way the 2015 Clean Water Rule was, and it does not fully implement the Clean Water Act as Congress intended. So that was Matt asked me to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've, you know, those of us that have been working in this arena for a while have seen this definition, these rules change on a, you know, they've been a moving target for quite some time. So my commentary here is our question in commentary is that it may change again in the future.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted to add one thing. The comment letter that we sent was co-signed by, I think it was 12 scientific societies representing about 200,000 members. So this was a much greater consensus than even just the SWS society, and we drew on the expertise of academics and national level experts. So it was a very well researched, very well documented comment letter with extensive citations.
Great, thank you. And Paul, just a question. It's a question on another one from Adam. Has the NWPR changed the, I guess it's the adjudicatory process, AJD, in the US, in the New England district, and is the preliminary JD option remaining? You know, so we'd just like to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, the AJD is the approved jurisdictional determination.
Okay.
And it has not. Basically, it's done the same way as it was done prior to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. If an area has to be called non-jurisdictional, it still has to go through an approved jurisdictional determination. The majority of cases, we still go through the preliminary jurisdictional determination. That's where we can approve the delineation boundary itself, Again, it assumes everything is jurisdictional. If it benefits the applicant for that not to be the case, then they would want to go through an AJD. But simply, if they're more concerned about the time of the project, if the state's already regulating and requiring mitigation and so on, then it's not often worth their time, the additional time to go through an AJD. But we're still using the preliminary jurisdictional determinations on the majority of our general permits projects.
Great, thank you. Just gonna wrap up with two questions before we move on to Ingeborg. One, there was a question from Meredith. I think it's more for curiosity because it's outside New England, but does anyone know the basis for the stay in Colorado?
That had to do, maybe someone else can go. I can offer a little bit, but not a ton, so.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Gillian?
Okay, all right. So my understanding is that it has to do with the relationship between the federal regulations and the state regulations in Colorado, and it was going to create a real tangle for the state if they implemented the NWPR without addressing their state regulations as well. And I've forgotten the details, but it was something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay, and then maybe either one of you, in New England, in our neighbors, New York and New Jersey, pretty much this 8-state area all has state wetland protection acts and regulations. How do you see this? I think at the state level, things don't change. How does this affect the interaction between the Corps and the states? Certainly in New England, where all 6 states have their GPs.
Right, and that's something that we've been trying to work with the states early on. As soon as we knew this thing was coming out and we had to hit the ground, we've had a training with the New England states, also with the tribes in New England, and we're setting up cooperating us, the Corps and EPA, and including the states that are interested at least in participating, with outreach to the general public in December. Our current plan, which is a draft plan, so it could change before then, but we're looking at putting out information in the week of December 7th and the week of December 14th. One of these types, and it'll be this type of thing online, of course, outreach to the public, to the practitioners, aiming at each state. A lot of the information is going to be the same because it is general to our regulation, the federal regulation. The states are still talking to us about how or if it affects the GPs, what things are, and that does vary because each GP is different with each state. So we're still in the process of working with the state to try and smooth out any things that may need to be smoothed out in the GPs, looking at kind of making sure we identify each other's issues. For instance, we're required under guidance of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule to have information in any JD letter we send out about them contacting NRCS regarding PCC or something. Well, someone suggested from the state earlier this week, why don't you have the same one of the states? We should have the same thing with the state thing. Just because the Corps doesn't have jurisdiction, refer them to, you should still talk to Massachusetts or New Hampshire or whoever, because they may have that. So we're looking at changing our basic JD letters to make sure that we sort of point them over to the state, and the state would do the same for us to try and look. And that's just the jurisdiction aspect of it. We're still trying to figure out how things may affect the operation of some of the GPs themselves. So I don't have a good answer right now.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Paul, that's good. And thank you, Gillian and Paul, for your presentations. Can't all clap. We're in a conference room, but thank you. Very informative. And I'd like, in our closing remarks, just to have Ingeborg jump in. And she has a couple of things to say.
Hi, everybody. I thought that was very helpful, you guys, and more to be developed. But my closing remarks are to thank our wonderful secretary who's passing the baton, and that is Ruth Ladd. And Ruth, I'm going to embarrass you just a little bit. You know, you've been, anyone who's worked with you knows that you have an incredible, calm, practical approach to wetland science and implementing regulatory programs. You've been so involved in mitigation and in-lieu fee policy development and guidance development. And one of your coworkers told me this great story that you wanted to do a comparative assessment of two different ice cream stands after a long day in the field, and that you all ate lots of ice cream from two different places, but the results were inconclusive. I would just like to say that during your role as secretary, you also approached all our debates and our efforts and some of our anxieties with the same kind of practical calmness. And so we just wanted to thank you for all your service and for your continued involvement, I hope. And I can't give you a gift right now, but we have sent one, and it's you should be getting it today or tomorrow in the mail. And it's something that, let's just say, it won't help your waistline, but I figured with the ice cream, this is a perfect gift. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I appreciate all your service, and I hope that you continue to stay active in the chapter. Thank you all the participants, all the panelists. And
Can I
the
just say
staff
thank
from
you to the board?
Oh, go ahead, Ruth. Yes.
Thank you. That's really sweet. It's been I just had such a fun time. I love my job. But I must say I love retirement. So anyway, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I have to echo Ingeborg, both working with you here at the chapter, but also professionally. Your calmness, your practicality, your pragmatic approach has always been, it's always a hallmark of working with you.
And I just want to add one thing. She has the nicest way of saying, no, not so much, when we come up with and it's true also with our society stuff. But yeah, you come up with an idea, she kind of looks at you very nicely and she goes, yeah, not so much. But anyway.
But anyways, thank you, everybody, panelists, SWS staff, and the participants. I know it's not as fun as being together in person and checking out sites in the field together, and then going and talking about really interesting topics. As I said, hopefully next year, a little bit earlier, we'll be doing this in person in Vermont. If we can't do it in the fall, I would suggest maybe a wintertime in Vermont near Okemo or Stowe or Mount Snow, but that might end up being a ski trip as opposed to a conference. But no, we hope everyone will be able to join us next year. And in the interim, I've seen some of the comments and whatnot about getting our LinkedIn account more active, and it's something that I hear, and we're gonna work on trying to increase our footprint in the social media world, especially now since we're not seeing each other in person. So with that, I think we'd like to adjourn this year's conference. If anyone has anything else to say in closing, if not, we will move on, and thank you, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you in person in a little less than a year. Bye-bye.